The ballroom shimmered with soft golden lights, crystal chandeliers hanging high above rows of elegantly dressed guests. Laughter drifted through the air as people moved from table to table, greeting old friends and exchanging compliments. It was the kind of charity gala where appearances seemed to matter as much as generosity. At a table near the corner sat a woman named Victoria. She wore a navy blue suit that was simple yet refined, her dark hair neatly styled. A wheelchair rested beneath her, making her impossible to overlook. Yet somehow, throughout the evening, she felt invisible. As guests arrived, they smiled at one another, shook hands, and formed small circles of conversation. Several people glanced toward Victoria, but their eyes quickly moved away. Some offered polite nods before turning back to their groups. Others acted as though she wasn't there at all. Victoria had experienced moments like this before. People often assumed things the moment they saw the wheelchair. They imagined weakness, dependence, or limitations they knew nothing about. Few bothered to learn who she was before deciding how much attention she deserved. She wasn't hurt easily anymore, but that didn't mean it never stung. For nearly an hour, she sat quietly with a glass of sparkling water in her hand, observing the room. She watched conversations begin and end, watched invitations to dance being exchanged, watched strangers welcomed more warmly than she was. At one point, two women passed nearby.
"Do you know her?"
one whispered. The other shrugged. No idea, maybe someone's guest. They continued walking without another glance. Victoria forced a faint smile and looked away. She hadn't attended the event for recognition. In fact, very few people there even knew her name. She preferred it that way. Tonight was supposed to be a rare evening away from endless meetings, reports, and responsibilities. Still, she couldn't ignore the loneliness settling over her. Just as she considered leaving early, the empty chair across from her suddenly moved. A man in his late 30s stood there with a warm, slightly nervous smile. Beside him was a young boy holding a small dessert plate. "Excuse me," the man said. "My son noticed you're sitting alone, and honestly, so did I. Would you mind if we joined you?" For the first time that evening, Victoria looked genuinely surprised. Not because someone had spoken to her, but because they had spoken to her like she was simply another person in the room. Victoria blinked for a moment, caught off guard by the man's simple kindness. Most people who approached her in public did so with awkwardness or excessive sympathy. This felt different. There was no pity in his voice, no hesitation, and no sign that he was trying to impress anyone. Just genuine friendliness. "Not at all," she replied. "Please, have a seat." The man pulled out a chair while the young boy eagerly sat beside him. "I'm Daniel," he said, extending his hand. "Victoria. And this troublemaker is my son, Noah." "I'm not a troublemaker," Noah protested immediately. Victoria laughed. "That's exactly what troublemakers usually say." Noah grinned, clearly pleased that she was joking with him. The conversation began naturally after that. There were no uncomfortable questions about her wheelchair and no curious stares. Daniel talked about his work as a project manager for a small construction company, while Noah enthusiastically described his soccer team, his favorite video games, and the science project he was convinced would win first place at school. Victoria found herself smiling more than she had all evening. "What about you?" Daniel asked after a while. "What do you do?" Victoria took a sip of water. "Oh, a little bit of everything." Daniel chuckled. That's usually what people say when they don't want to talk about work. "You caught me." "Fair enough, I don't blame you. If I could go one evening without discussing deadlines and budgets, I'd probably do the same." The three of them continued talking while guests moved around the ballroom. Several people glanced toward their table, surprised to see Victoria laughing. Noah soon became comfortable enough to ask questions that adults usually avoided. "Can I ask something?" "Of course," Victoria replied. "Were you always in a wheelchair?" Daniel looked embarrassed. "Noah, you don't have to ask that." "It's okay," Victoria said gently. She explained that an accident years earlier had changed her life. It had been difficult, but she had learned to adapt. "What was the hardest part?" Noah asked. Victoria thought carefully before answering. "Honestly, not learning how to use a wheelchair." "What then?" She looked around the room before meeting the boy's eyes. Learning that some people stop seeing you for who you are. Noah frowned as he glanced across the ballroom. That's silly. Victoria smiled. I agree. For a moment, neither Daniel nor Victoria spoke. Children had a way of seeing truths that adults often complicated. And sitting there with Daniel and Noah, Victoria realized something she hadn't felt since arriving that evening. She no longer felt alone. As dinner continued, the atmosphere around the table grew lighter. Noah was telling an animated story about accidentally kicking a soccer ball through a neighbor's flower bed, and even Daniel couldn't stop laughing. You left out the part where you hid behind me when the neighbor came outside, Daniel said. I was being strategic, Noah replied with complete seriousness. Victoria laughed so hard that tears briefly formed in her eyes. For the first time that evening, she wasn't thinking about the people who had ignored her. But across the ballroom, others had started noticing something unusual. Several guests who had barely acknowledged Victoria earlier now kept glancing toward her table. They seemed puzzled by how easily she fit into the conversation. The lonely woman in the corner they had dismissed appeared confident, intelligent, and genuinely happy. One of the event organizers approached the stage and tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Conversations around the room gradually quieted. We'd like to take a moment to recognize a special guest whose contributions have helped fund several of our community programs this year. People turned toward the stage. The organizer smiled. Many of the scholarships, rehabilitation initiatives, and family support services we celebrate tonight would not exist without the leadership and generosity of Victoria Hayes. A large screen behind the stage suddenly displayed a photograph of Victoria. The room fell silent. Daniel looked from the screen to Victoria, confused. The organizer continued. As Chief Executive Officer of Hayes Innovations, Victoria has dedicated both her company and personal resources to helping thousands of families across the country. A wave of whispers spread through the ballroom. Some guests looked genuinely shocked. Others appeared embarrassed. A few of the same people who had ignored Victoria earlier now stared at her with sudden interest. Daniel blinked. Wait, you're the CEO of Hayes Innovations? Victoria gave a small smile. I suppose that's one way to introduce me. You never mentioned it. You never asked. Daniel laughed softly. That's true. The organizer invited Victoria to the stage. As she wheeled forward, applause filled the room. Yet what struck her wasn't the applause. It was how quickly people's expressions had changed. An hour earlier, many of them had dismissed her without knowing anything about her. Now they were eager to smile, wave, and gain her attention. When Victoria reached the microphone, she paused before speaking. Her eyes briefly found Daniel and Noah sitting together at their table. Then she smiled, and she knew exactly what she wanted to say. Victoria waited until the applause faded. The ballroom was silent now. Dozens of faces were turned toward her, many of them the same faces that had overlooked her earlier in the evening. She adjusted the microphone. Thank you for the kind introduction, she began. But before I say anything else, I'd like to talk about something that happened tonight. A few guests exchanged uncertain looks. When I arrived, I spent nearly an hour sitting alone. The room became noticeably still. No one was rude to me. No one said anything unkind. Yet most people chose not to approach me. Victoria's voice remained calm, free of bitterness. I've lived with a disability for many years, so this isn't a new experience. People often make assumptions before they know anything about me. Sometimes they assume I need help. Sometimes they assume I have little to offer. Most of the time, they simply don't see me at all. Several guests lowered their eyes. Victoria continued. Then something different happened. She glanced toward Daniel and Noah. A father and his son walked over and invited me to join them. They didn't know my job title. They didn't know about my company. They didn't know I was speaking tonight. A soft smile crossed her face. They only knew that someone was sitting alone. The audience followed her gaze to Daniel and Noah. Daniel looked uncomfortable with the attention, while Noah sat proudly in his chair. Victoria continued, Kindness has the most value when there's nothing to gain from it. That's what made their gesture so meaningful. The room erupted into applause again, this time directed toward Daniel and his son. Noah's face turned bright red. After the event ended, guests who had ignored Victoria earlier lined up to introduce themselves. Some offered compliments, others attempted awkward conversations. Victoria greeted them politely, but she noticed something important. The most genuine conversation of the entire evening had happened before anyone knew who she was. As she prepared to leave, Daniel approached. "I hope the speech didn't embarrass Noah." "It did," Noah admitted. Everyone laughed. Victoria smiled at both of them. "You reminded me of something tonight." "What's that?" Daniel asked. "That good people still exist." As they said their goodbyes, Victoria felt grateful, not because people had finally recognized her status, but because two strangers had recognized her humanity. Moral lesson: never judge a person's worth by their appearance, circumstances, or abilities. True character is revealed by how we treat people when we have nothing to gain from them. Kindness given freely is often more valuable than success, wealth, or status.